This lecture is brought to you by the Jerusalem Sober House. The Jerusalem Sober House is a structured, sober living facility located in the heart of Jerusalem, Israel. For more information on the Jerusalem Sober House and the services we provide, please visit us online at www.jerusalemsoberhouse.com. We hope you enjoy this lecture.
You know, my friends, you're not making good use of your time. I have learned much, much more from you than you can ever learn from me. And when you meet together and you share your life's experiences, you're really getting something of value. I don't have that to give you. The book, Mesilat Yesharim, Path of the Just, starts off by saying that life is a series of nisyonot. It's a series of trials and tests, and challenges and stresses and hardships. I've been blessed because I didn't have those. And I have, thank God, had a quite smooth sailing. Yeah, little problems here and there, right? But when I meet with people who are in recovery, or people who have had major challenges, major stresses, right, and have come through them, and have triumphed and have overcome the obstacles, right? I mean, what have you got to learn from me? Right? Like I say, I have learned so much from you. I consider you all my teachers. And anything that I've written about regard to recovery is stuff that I've taken from you, and I'm giving it back to you. Right? And many times I did my writings after a meeting. Right? I went to a meeting, I heard what the people said, and I just wrote it and fed it back to them. And I fed it back primarily to people who are not in the program, who are not in addiction, or they don't know that they're addicts, because they don't have access to it. I don't know if you're aware how fortunate you are to be in recovery, because that's what Mesilat Yesharim is talking about. Faith, taking life at its terms. Now, there was a time in your life when you didn't take life on its terms, and you wanted life on your terms. Right? But you see where that got you. Right? And so you came around to doing what the Serenity Prayer says. Right? Taking life on its terms. So I really don't have much to share with you other than what you have shared with me. So I'll feed it back to you. You know, I believe that the 12-step program was plagiarized. I believe that Bill Wilson plagiarized the books of Musa, the ethical books of the Jewish ethicists, especially of the last 200 years, because I've said many times that if I had to write a recovery program for addiction based on the works of Torah, it would end up word for word the 12 steps, not one thing different. And you've enriched me with stories. Right? So I have nothing original to tell you. And I came across something beautiful the other day, a one-liner that says, all wisdom is plagiarism. The only thing that's original is stupidity. Okay? But if you got some wisdom, you'll find it's already been said. Right? And going to the meetings is so enriching. Of course, You don't always get the results in the first meeting, or in the 5th meeting, or in the 100th meeting. I've been going to meetings since 1961. I may have to tell you, I like to tell about that anyway, so I probably will tell you how I got there. And the wealth of wisdom that comes through stories that you get in no other way. My friend Ernie Kurtz just came out with another book. The first book is The Spirituality of Imperfection. And now he came out with another book, The Spiritual Experience. And Ernie rightfully says, God created man because he loves stories. Right? And the strength of recovery is in our stories. You probably are aware of the story of how I got into this program. And for those of you who have heard it, you'll hear it again. I never started out to be an addictionologist. When I went to my yeshiva education, I never heard anything about alcoholism or drug addiction. And then when I went to medical school, for 4 years, I had all kinds of lectures. I learned about diseases that I'll never see in my life. Right? But nobody said a word about alcoholism and addiction, the most common condition that brings people into a doctor's office. And then I went into psychiatry. 3 years in psychiatric training. Well, certainly, psychiatrists are going to teach you about addiction. Not one lecture on addiction. Which, of course, maybe things have changed a little bit in the psychiatric education, but for all practical purposes, that means that when you consult a doctor or consult a psychiatrist, right, the chances are that the doctor or the psychiatrist knows very little about addiction. And that causes problems. But anyway, I started out to be a rabbi, and I was a rabbi for a number of years. I got discouraged with being a rabbi and went to medical school. And then when I got into psychiatric training, in my second year, I was on emergency duty. All of us guys in the residency program had to rotate the days on which we would be available for emergencies. So we didn't schedule ourselves heavily on those days. So I get a call to come to the emergency room. And I come there, and there's a woman who said she had to see a psychiatrist. It was an emergency. Well, what's a psychiatric emergency? The only psychiatric emergency I can think of really is suicide. Right? She was a 61-year-old woman. And I asked her, what's your problem? And so she tells me, I'm one of 3 daughters of an Episcopalian priest. When I was an adolescent, I began to drink. And by the time I was 20, I was a full-fledged alcoholic. I got married, had a little boy, and the child was 3 years old. My husband said to me, Isabel, what do you want? You want the family or you want the bottle? She says, I knew I could not stop drinking, and I knew it was not fair to him or to the child, so I gave him a divorce. When I met her when she was 61, she was still a very charming woman, and I can imagine that when she was single at age 28, she was a knockout. Right? And now she was unattached, so she began running an escort service with some of the elite of Pittsburgh society. And they kept her in a beautiful apartment with all the booze she wanted. And so she lived a very satisfying life for her at that time, for about 5 years. But then the alcohol began taking its effect. And her clients didn't want to be seen with her anymore. So she started serving a lower class population and very rapidly hit the skids. And so she was living in the flop house hotels, prostituting and drinking. Every once in a while, somebody would find Isabel passed out. They'd take her to the hospital, detox for a few days, take her to an AA meeting, discharged, get drunk again. When I took over the directorship of St. Francis Hospital, I was curious as to how many detoxes Isabel had had there. And it turned out that between 1936 and 1956, she had 69 detoxes at St. Francis Hospital. She had 23 detoxes at St. John's Hospital, and I couldn't get the information from the other hospitals. And when she was 56 years old, she contacted a lawyer friend. This lawyer had a weakness to help alkies, and he had gotten her out of a lot of scraps. And she said to him, "David, I need a favor from you." He said, "Oh, for God's sake, Isabel, now what did you do?" She said, "I didn't do anything. I want you to take me to court, or take me before a judge, put me away in a state mental hospital for a year." See, at that time there was a provision in the Pennsylvania law that you could commit a chronic alcoholic by court order for a year. That provision was generally used by families who wanted to get rid of a pesky drunk. No one had ever come up and said, "Please put me in a state hospital for a year by court order." State hospital is not the place for a vacation. I worked there. But she prevailed on this lawyer, and he finally took her to court, and she got committed to the state hospital for a year. The day she got out of the hospital, she was sober for a year. She went to an AA meeting, and within a few days, she found herself a job. Her job was as a housekeeper for a very famous physician who was the world's worst alcoholic. And she had to take care of him, which included picking him up off the floor at night. Because of his prominence, he was called to sit on some important foundations and also to testify at Senate meetings. And so Isabel would get a call from his children, and they would say, "Isabel, Dad has to be in Washington in 2 weeks. Get him in shape." So she had 2 weeks to detox him, to get him a haircut and shave, and put him on a fresh suit, drive him to the airport, and she would say, "Now, doctor, no drinking on the plane. No drinking in Washington. When you come back here tomorrow, I'll be waiting for you with your bottle." And he always listened. He never drank on the plane, never drank in Washington. I was so fascinated by this story that it didn't occur to me to ask her, "Why did you come to the emergency room? What was the emergency?" There was no emergency. But being a young psychiatrist who knew that people do not do anything without motivation, I wondered, What motivated this woman at age 56 to put herself in a state hospital for a year? What did she plan to get out of it? She had lost all contact with her family. They gave her up as dead. Why? So I wanted to know why she did what she did. That was a radical thing to do. And out of my curiosity, I said to her, Isabel, you better come back next week for another appointment. So she did. And we had an interesting session the second time, and I started learning things a little bit about alcoholism. I still don't know why she would put herself in the state hospital. And then after a few sessions, I said to her, Isabel, how are you staying sober? She said, well, I go to Alcoholics Anonymous. I said, what's that? Now, today, everybody knows Alcoholics Anonymous. 1961, nobody knew Alcoholics Anonymous. It was before Betty Ford and before Jason Robart. So she says, well, this is a meeting that we have. And I said, who does the treatment at the meeting? She says, well, sometimes we have discussions, sometimes we have a speaker. I said, well, do you have psychologists there? She says, well, there's one psychologist who comes around sometimes, but he's drunk most of the time. I said, Isabel, something is happening at those meetings that's keeping you sober, and I want to know what it is. Do you think you can get me into one of those meetings? She said, sure. 1961, she took me to my first meeting. And I quickly realized that the program has nothing to do with alcohol, nothing to do with drugs, nothing to do with gambling, nothing to do with food, nothing to do with sex. What the program is all about is enabling a person to make significant changes in their personality and character. And all the steps are dedicated to that, right? Discovering your defects, sharing it with another person, all right? Making amends. I mean, everything has to do with becoming a better person. And one meeting that I attended, Marty was celebrating his 35th anniversary, and he said, started off by saying, the man I once was drank, and the man I once was will drink again. And that says it all. Right? Marty doesn't drink because he's not the same person. If he ever goes back to being the sober Marty that he once was, well, that sober Marty drank. Right? So it's not a question of stopping to drink, or stopping to use drugs, or stopping gambling. It's becoming a different person. And I realized that at the first meeting. And I realized, wait a minute. Here I've got a program that can help a person make significant improvement in oneself. I can use that. So I started going to meetings. And I wanted a sponsor. But I couldn't find anybody who wants to sponsor me. So I didn't know what to do with me. And I finally found one person, wonderful person, a man who, he died at 84. The night before he died, he wrote into his little calendar, 16,482. That's how many days he was sober. He was a wonderful person. And he understood what I was after, and he helped me work the steps, and the fourth step, and the fifth step, made me do the fourth step 6 times. But the program has been of enormous, enormous help to me. I had loads of problems with anger and resentment. And I've had enormous progress in overcoming anger and resentments. And I still go to meetings. I don't go as often as I used to, simply because it's hard for me to get around. But I still have to go to meetings because I still have personality defects. And when people ask me, in recovery, early recovery. How long do we have to go to meetings? I said, as long as you have character defects. Now, if you ever get to the point where you no longer have any character defects, then you don't have to go anymore. But you won't have any problem because you'll be dead by then. Because none of us ever reach perfection, and only God is perfect. For some reason or other, he always goes to meetings. Right? Right? So, it has had an enormous effect on helping me deal with the most common human problem of humans. And that is something that I've sort of dedicated my career to, and that is helping people become aware that their basic problem, unless it's a biochemical problem, their basic psychological problem is feeling negatively about oneself. Right? Low self-esteem is at the root of every problem. Not only addiction, but every problem. Now, there are some problems that are like bipolar, that are distorted chemistry. But if we set aside those problems, but just the everyday problems that people have in life, right, there's no question in my mind. The basic problem is low self-esteem, which means simply an inaccurate, a distorted concept of oneself. Right? And unless we do something to overcome that and get a correct self-concept, right, everybody, right, man, woman, and child, right, has negative, unwarranted feelings of inferiority. Now, you might say, well, yeah, if a person has a traumatic childhood, parents who are abusive, neglecting, physical illnesses, siblings that are overshadowing them. I didn't have any of that. My parents were very caring, very wonderful, very loving. Right? We weren't wealthy. We certainly we're not proved. I never was deprived of anything. I succeeded in everything I did. Right? At age 9, I was a chess prodigy. Right? I graduated high school at 16, became a rabbi at 21, went to medical school at age 25, graduated at 29, became a psychiatrist 3 years later, and all the time not being aware that I was living my life based on my feeling that I was an unwanted and unlikable person. And that was something very hard to live with. And in order for me to survive, I had to have reassurance. And I had to have approval from every human being on earth. Okay? And to make sure that I got approval, I became a people pleaser. I did everything to try and get people to like me. I did some crazy things to get people to like me. Let me just give you one simple example that stands out in my mind. It was the end of November once, around Thanksgiving Day. A woman who was a member of our congregation, my father's congregation, came in crying because her brother, who was a member of the shul, was taken to the hospital with chest pain. Well, I hopped in the car, and I drove to the hospital. It was a 10-minute drive. And I met with his doctors, and the doctor said, I don't think it's a heart attack. He's got chest pain, probably some other source, but we'll keep him for observation. Okay. Friday, I paid him another visit, met with him, met with his doctors. He was doing fine. And the doctor said this was the day before you were not allowed to stay in the hospital more than 11 minutes. Right? They were going to keep him in the hospital for over the weekend for observation. You can never do that today. But the doctors reassured me that he was fine. They're going to send him home after the weekend. That Shabbat, it was the end of November, It was a cold day and it was a rainy day. Remember, I lived 10 minutes from the hospital by car. After shul and after the morning meal, which was about 12:30, I walked 4 miles to the hospital to visit Frank. Right? Now, had I waited 4 hours, Shabbat would have been over, and I could have gotten there in 10 minutes by car instead of walking for an hour 4 miles in the rain. What kind of insanity was it to do that? Well, it's only one reason. Because Frank would say, what a wonderful person the rabbi is. He walked all the way from 54th Street right, to 12th Street. He walked all the way to see me. So I did this ridiculous thing in order to get Frank's approval. But you see, if there were 6 billion people in the world, I need 6 billion people's approval. And if anybody looked at me the wrong way, oh my God. Yeah. My sensitivity to criticism was just unbelievable. I was asked to give lectures to addiction counselors who needed continuing education courses at the University of Southern California. 110 counselors had signed up for the course, and I gave 2 lectures on a Tuesday. Now, when you take a lecture, a course for credit, you have to fill out a evaluation form at the end. So a month later, right, I get a packet from the University of South Carolina, 110 evaluation forms on my performance. And as I'm going through them, my ego is going through the ceiling. You should see the wonderful things they're saying about me. 109 glowing evaluations. One person was not pleased with my performance, and I was depressed for 3 weeks. After 3 weeks, it sunk into my head that 109 to 1 is not a bad score. And furthermore, that person who gave a negative evaluation probably was in a depressed mood that day and just saw everything negatively. But it's so absurd to get depressed for 3 weeks because one person did not like your performance and 109 people thought it was glowing. That's what happens when you have inferiority feelings. And I had no right to them. Right? Through an incident, I was not aware of this. I was not aware that I had these crazy inferiority feelings. And then you're familiar with the story that I had in the spa in Hot Springs, Arkansas, right, where I could not stay in the whirlpool bath for more than 5 minutes, right? And a psychologist friend clarified it for me. And he says, you didn't have anything to divert you in the whirlpool bath, right? You had nobody to talk to, nothing to look at, nothing to read, nothing to do, nothing to listen to, right? They deprived you of all diversions, and you were left in immediate contact with yourself. And obviously, you couldn't like it, right? So there's something wrong with how you feel about yourself. I was 38 years old at that time, right? And that's when I began to do a little bit of a true research into who I am and what I am. And over a period of years, and doing the 4th step 6 times, I've come to an evaluation of myself that is totally different. Why that is so important is clear. You see, there is no way that you can make a good adjustment to reality if you don't have a correct perception of reality. Right? I mean, one of the patients in the chronic state hospital that I worked at was psychotic, who said he was president of the World Bank. Right? Well, if you're president of the World Bank, how come you're sharing a bedroom with 60 other people? Right? But, his delusions don't have to make sense. Right? He had a distortion of reality. Right? And if you've got a distortion of reality, if you think you're a multi-billionaire, right, and you're not, you're going to get into trouble. Now, if your reality is that you are attractive and bright and personable, right, and skillful and talented, and if you don't know that, right, then you've got a distortion of reality. And therefore, people who walk around like I did with unwarranted feelings of negativity, right, they have a serious distortion of reality, because the most important part of my reality was me. And the most important part of reality of your reality is you. Right? And if your self-image is all screwed up, right, you're going to have problems. Furthermore, if I feel about myself negatively, right, automatically I will make the judgment that everybody who looks at me sees that negativity. Yeah? If I see a garbage can, I assume anybody who's going to look at that is going to see a garbage can. They're not going to look at a rose bush. They're not going to see what's not there. Why did I determine that? Because I assume people see what I think they see. And if I'm negative about myself, then I feel everybody in the world is going to see my negativity. Right? And you can see what that'll do to relationships, what that'll do to a marriage, right? What that'll do to parenting. And that's why having an accurate self-esteem is the most important thing you can do in the world. And why do we have such a poor self-esteem? It comes from two opinions. One is from Freud. Freud had a lot of difficulty with this. But Freud later on in his life came to the conclusion that there are two opposite instincts in every human being. One is the survival instinct, and one is a death wish. Right? Now, Freud couldn't make any sense of it because he didn't believe in creation. So everything happened by evolution. In evolution, the only things that should persist and prevail are those kinds of things that help preservation of the species. Well, how does the death wish fit into that? And Freud said he didn't understand why it was there, but he had no choice. He saw that it was a fact. And what he's talking about is that in every person there is a destructive force that's within us, and we have no choice about it. Right? And it will lead us to do destructive things. Right? 40 years before Freud, one of our great rabbis, one of our great ethicists, made a comment on a verse in Psalms, right, where he says that we have a force within us that tries to crush us. And that's part of our being. So we've got a lot of drives, right? And what we did not know is that we have a self-destructive drive. And people find that difficult to believe. Right? And that self-destructive drive is the one that tells us about how no good we are. Right? Now, of course, if you have abusive parents or other traumas or deprivations in childhood, that makes it that much worse. But even if you have everything positive, like I had in my childhood, and everything wonderful happening to me in my life, and not having any major deprivations or trauma, I still had a horrible self-image because of this force that Freud described, or that the rabbi described. Thanatos, a crushing drive within each person. And of course, it's a mistake to say everybody who has this feeling is because their parents were abusive. Not necessarily. My parents were not abusive. I was my father's favorite. The sun rose and set on me. then what happened? Why did I develop this horrible negative feeling? Right? Because of this drive that Freud described and the Rabbi described. I believe it's there. And of course, it has led many of us into addiction. But not only into addiction, it can lead us into many destructive things. Like walking 4 miles in the rain when you don't have to. Right? Doing other nutty things like that. Right? So what's our solution? Now, first, if you believe in the power of prayer, and you do what the program says, right, is you pray to God to remove your defects. And the great sage, the Chofetz Chaim of the last generation, no one ever saw him angry. Okay? But he used to come into the shul every night and open up the Aron Kodesh, the Ark of Torah, and used to cry bitterly for God to take his feelings away of anger. Right? He could control his behavior, so he never got into a rage, but he couldn't control his feelings. Right? So being that he couldn't control his feelings, he said, look, I don't like these feelings, take them away. And obviously, since he repeated that every night, right, God did not take him away. And he let him struggle with them. Right? And so that's one of the things that the program had taught me. Right? There's a lot of feelings that I had that I didn't like, but I came to realize they're part of my animal being. Hey, come on, I came into this world as an animal. There's a beautiful description in the book of Job that says, a person comes into the world like a wild ass. Right? And what we're supposed to do is transfer this wild ass, not to become an angel, because God has enough angels, doesn't need any more, right? But to become a spiritual being. Right? Now, you know my bias. The spirituality is a very important component of religion, but it isn't religion. Right? And therefore, you can be a very spiritual person, even though you're not a religion. You don't have to believe in God to be spiritual. Right? You can't be religious without being spiritual. Right? If you're religious without being spiritual, that's just some kind of sham. Right? But you can be spiritual without being religious. Right? And so I've seen this in the program. I have some wonderful people. Isabel is just an example of it. Isabel was the daughter of an Episcopalian priest. She never went into a church. She said, I don't believe that God lives in a building. Right? But she gave 1/10 of all her income to the church. I mean, she was a very interesting person. And by the way, I never did discover why she came that day. There was no emergency. And how come she came on that day when I was on duty? Who engineered that? Right? Because it was Isabel that got me into the program. Right? And Isabel's responsible for my building gateway and for everything else I've done. Right? So I see Isabel as having been a messenger, an agent of God to get me into learning something about alcoholism and addiction and trying to help some people with it. Right? But what was Isabel's motivation? What made her, at age 56, take such a radical step, putting herself in a state hospital for a year? What did she plan to accomplish with it? I think the answer is that in every person there is a nucleus of self-respect. It's part of our makeup. But sometimes, for whatever reason, whether it's the thanatos feeling, the self-destructive wish, for some reason or other, that's very often deeply concealed, and we're not aware it's there. We're not aware of the good within us. Right? But that force, that good force, tries to come to our awareness. And then one day it happens. And when that happens, that's a spiritual awakening. And that's what happened to Isabel, where for some reason or other, she had a spiritual awakening at age 56, which made her realize, I have no right to do this to myself. I have no right to be less of a human being, less of a good person than I can be. And she realized what alcohol was doing to her. Right? And I think that that's one of the greatest things we have to do in recovery. Look for the good in ourselves. The problem is, though we focus on the bad in ourselves, we don't think enough about the good in ourselves. Right? When I did my fourth step and I gave it to John, he made me do it 3 times. And at the end of the third time, he said, Dr. Twerski, I asked you for an inventory, and you gave me a chimney sweep. I said, what do you mean? He says, you've told me every wrong thing that you've ever done in your life. Why haven't you told me about some of the good things that you've done? Isn't there anything good about you? Right? I want you to go back and do the inventory, and this time I want you to tell me all the good things about you. You know that it was harder for me to do that than to tell him about my screw-ups? Right? And this is what we have to do. We have to find the good in ourselves. Rabbi Nachman of Roslov says, look hard to find only one good thing about yourself. Right? Find one good thing about yourself and capitalize on it. And he's right. And my best example of that is the woman who decided that one of the chairs in her living room was very shabby, got to get rid of it. Okay. She got rid of it and she bought a new chair. Oh, well, now the sofa doesn't fit with that. Right? Now that the new chair is there, it makes the sofa look terrible. Well, she got a new sofa. But now the carpet is just out of sync. The carpet. And now the drapes. Right? And now the pictures. And then the lamps. And the wallpaper. It all started off by one beautiful chair. You see, there are incompatibilities. Right? If we develop one good trait and capitalize it and try and make it as good as we can, right? Many of the things about us that need improvement we'll become aware of them, and we'll try to bring them into compatibility with this one good trait. This is why it's so tremendously important that instead of looking back on all the bad things that a person has done in his life, and we've all had our share of things, of mistakes we've made, right? That we start looking at the good within ourselves. Right? And you know my story of the diamond. Not too bad that I didn't bring that plaque with me. Right? That what a recovery place is really a diamond polishing center. Right? We are all diamonds, but we don't know that the diamond is within us. And that's what recovery helps us do. Helps us discover the good within us. And that's why I found that so many wonderful, wonderful people in the program who've been there, veterans, and have worked the program for years and have worked the steps seriously. You know, when I was in Pittsburgh, I was president of the Allegheny County Medical Society, 2,000 physicians, wonderful physicians. Many of them were wonderful doctors. I needed a doctor for myself. My doctor was a member of AA. Right? I needed a urologist. Right? He was a member of NA. Right? My granddaughter moved into town. My daughter moved into town with my grandchildren. Needed a pediatrician. Got a pediatrician from AA. Why? For obvious reason, I wanted the best. Right? Now, I'm not saying that everybody in the 12-step program is a saint. That's not true. But among the program, among people who have had a sincere recovery, you will find people who I can consider real tzaddikim. wonderful people, Jewish and non-Jewish. They're highly spiritual people. But what about their past lives? They've managed to overcome it and managed to make the radical change. My doctor, I trusted my life to him. But before he came into recovery, he was drunk, sitting in front of this bathroom door where his wife and daughter had barricaded themselves, and he was sitting in front of the bathroom with a shotgun, screaming at them, "I'm going to shoot your goddamn heads off!" And he kept on screaming. And then finally, when the screaming subsided, they opened the door a crack and they saw he had fallen asleep. So they tiptoed out and called the police. He went into detox, came to Gateway, and later on became my physician. This is the guy I trusted with my life. My dear grandchildren, whom I loved so dearly, I needed a good pediatrician for that. Eleanor was a pediatrician who ended up with a suicide attempt. She would get up in the morning shaking until she got her first drink. But that put her into a dilemma. She had to be in children's hospital at 8 o'clock. She can't go in there shaking. And she can't go in there smelling of alcohol. So what do? Well, Eleanor found a solution. She drank vanilla extract every morning. And if you ever tasted vanilla extract, you'll understand the desperation of this person. But that's the person who I chose to care for my kids. And I've seen so many wonderful people. There was one gentleman who was a cocaine addict, heroin, cocaine. He wasn't discriminatory. And one time I met him, and he said to me, "I was just offered a deal which I think I can make a lot of money with it. And it's not illegal, but there's just something not right about it. And I can't do that, because if I do that, I'll go back to drugs." Right? It gives you a sense of honesty and a sense of responsibility. Right? And the wonderful statement at the end, "And practice these principles in all your affairs." Right? In all your affairs. All your affairs means how we work, how we love, how we relate to our spouses, how we relate to our in-laws, how we relate to our children, right? To practice these principles in all your affairs. Right? Realize what life would be like, what the world would be like, right, if everybody practiced the 12 steps. Right? That would truly be a paradise. Right? And I think the 12 steps are God's gift to humanity. And people ask me sometimes, how come he chose Bill Wilson to do it? Right? Why didn't God choose a Jewish prophet to do it? We believe in the Messiah. We believe in Mashiach. Right? There is only one prophecy in the Torah, one prophet in the Torah who speaks about Mashiach, and that's Bilam. And Bilam was the worst of the worst of the worst. And God chose him to tell about Mashiach. I don't know why God does these things. And I don't know why God chose Bill Wilson. But no, I accept this wonderful gift of the 10 steps, although I believe that Bill Wilson plagiarized Musar. How he got access to it, I'll never know. Right? There's so many wonderful things in the simplicity of the program. Because it really is, keep it simple. That's such a tremendous thing. Don't complicate things. Right? Keep things simple. Right? Of course, if you keep it simple, then you'll have a solution. Then you won't have what to do. Right? So we complicate things. We have our stinking thinking. Right? But I've watched people with simplicity that just astounds me. Like, one young fellow comes into a meeting, and he meets one of the old-timers there, and he says to him, "You mean tell me that you haven't had a single drink in 30 years?" I said, "Yeah, that's right." "Well, what's your trick? I can't get through a week." I said, "I don't have any tricks. I get up every morning. I ask God, please God, give me another day of sobriety. And the night before I go to sleep, I say, thank you, God, for having given me another day of sobriety." So this guy says to him, "Well, how do you know it was God who gave you the day of sobriety?" He looks at me and he says, "Look, stupid, I didn't ask anybody else." That simplicity is just disarming. Right? And the simplicity of the program, it really is such an uncomplicated program. Yeah. Avoid dishonesty. You don't have to have a good memory if you don't lie. Right? And the practicality of the program is just enormous. So, you don't have to learn anything from me. Right? All I can tell you is things that I got from the program and feed them back to you. Now, if you haven't read the book by Ernie Kurtz, The Spirituality of Imperfection, get a hold of a copy of it and read it. There's one beautiful story that I think is worthwhile repeating. Incidentally, Ernie is a Catholic. The book is full of stories, right? About a third of them are Hasidic Jewish stories. Some of them he got from me. But one beautiful story that he tells is that the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, before his death, he called together his disciples, and he gave them each an assignment, what they are to do, their mission. And this one person, he said, this one student, he said, you are to travel from town to town and tell people about the things that I've taught. And tell people about me and tell them the things that you've seen. And you keep on doing that, and then one day, when you hear your story, you'll know that you fulfilled your mission. Well, the guy started going around from village to village, and wherever he met a group of people, he would go into a shul to talk to people and try and tell them about the Baal Shem Tov. He ended up one day in a town in Italy. And he was telling people these stories about the Baal Shem Tov, and they say, listen, there's a nobleman in town who loves to hear stories. He pays people to tell him stories, right? Go to him. So he went to this nobleman, and he was received warmly. And the nobleman says, yes, I'm really anxious. I'll pay you X amount of dinars for each story. And he sits there and he said, I can't think of any stories. Well, the guy said, look, you're probably tired from traveling from the trip. You know, stay overnight, rest up, it'll come to you. The next morning, he said, I don't know what happened to me. I had a repertoire of hundreds of stories. I can't think of anything. He said, stay over another day. Yeah, it'll come to you. Anyway, on the third day, he says, look, I don't know why this has happened, but there's no purpose in my staying here. I can't think of any stories. And just before he leaves, he stops and he says, wait, I just thought of something. It's not much of a story, but it's the only thing I can remember. This one week, it was the Holy Week, Easter week. The Baal Shem tells me he wants me to accompany him into a town. We came into that town, and we found that all the Jews were boarded up in their house, the windows shuttered, right? Because that week there was a tradition that in order to have a revenge for the crucifixion, a Jew has to be killed. So all the Jews had barricaded themselves in their house. And the Baal Shem Tov chose to rent a room in the Jewish section, opens up the windows and stands there openly. Why are you doing that? Well, pretty soon they see a procession. The bishop is leading the procession. And the Baal Shem Tov tells me, go tell the bishop that the Baal Shem Tov wants to see him. So he says, Master, you want me to get killed? He says, do what I tell you. Somehow or other, he reached the podium where the bishop was standing. And he tells the bishop, the Baal Shem Tov wants to see you. And the bishop said, after the service, I'll come. After the service, the bishop came, sat with the Baal Shem Tov for several hours. I don't know what went on there, right? And that's all I remember. So the nobleman said to him, you know, I was the bishop. And I recognized you as soon as you walked in. I was born a Jew, but I was orphaned, and the church took me in, and they raised me. They gave me a most wonderful life. And I was very bright, and I converted to Catholicism. And later on, I became a priest, and I was promoted to become a bishop. And many times I presided over the annual killing of a Jew in Easter. The night before you came to me, my father appeared to me in a dream. And he said, it's time that you go back to your faith of your fathers. So that when you came and you said the Baal Shem Tov wanted to see me, I knew it was not a coincidence. But when you couldn't think of a story to tell me, I realized I have not done good enough tshuva. Because the Baal Shem Tov told me during the time that I was sitting with him that the only time I know I was forgiven is when I hear my story. And when you came and you couldn't think of anything to say, I knew I was not forgiven. And so I sat up all night and cried. And I prayed. And I prayed for God to forgive me for everything that I did. Right? And now that you've told me this story, right, I realize I was forgiven. And the moral of the story, of course, is when you hear your story, you know you're forgiven. We can go to 1,000 meetings and hear our story and not hear it because not ready to hear it, right? Because our denial kicks in. But then one day, right, out of the blue, right, we may hear the same story that we heard 11 times before, but this time we hear it. And when we hear our story, we know we've been forgiven. So, my friends, what you have to do, look for the good in yourself. We are all unpolished diamonds. And if you find one good trait in yourself, capitalize on it and make it better. Right? And once you do that, you're going to find how that has a effect on, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, when you reach 84, you don't remember words, right?
I'm 37, I don't remember words. 37, I don't remember words.
What happens when you put a little stone into the, it forms a ripple effect. I couldn't think of the word ripple, right? Find one good trait in yourself and capitalize on it. Right? You may want one good trait is never say anything negative about another person. That's the mitzvah to avoid lashon hara, to avoid defamatory speech. Don't listen to any negative things about being said about anybody. Okay? You know, that's one good thing that you can pick up on. Not easy to do. Right? You just heard a good piece of gossip, of course you want to tell it to somebody. Right? Or somebody's talking to you and you have to stop them and say, I'm sorry, I don't want to hear the rest of this. Right? What you have to do, it's an amazing trait. Right? Capitalize it and watch what happens. Right? It's a magical thing. The ripple effect. And begin to think of yourself as good. And that's why you have to change the way you introduce yourself at a meeting. Right? The standard way is, hi everybody, my name is Frank, I'm an alcoholic. Hi everybody, my name is Jane, I'm a cross addict. That's not what you say. You say, hi everybody, my name is Frank, I am a beautiful person who's an alcoholic. I am a beautiful person who's a cross addict. Sure, we have to remember that we're addicts. If we ever forget that, we're in trouble. We'll relapse. But we also have to remember that we're good. That's what happened with Isabel. At age 56, something happened that she realized, I'm too good for this. Can't do this to myself anymore. Right? So I saw her once a week for 13 years. Right? And she never told me why she put herself in the state hospital. She wasn't even aware that that's what happened. But she had a spiritual awakening. That's what a spiritual awakening is all about. But you got to be careful, because I have an alarm clock that awakens me. Right? That doesn't mean I get up. Right? I can turn off the alarm clock and go back to sleep. Right? So sometimes if I know that I'm going to miss a plane if I don't get up, I take the alarm clock off of my nightstand and put it on the other side of the room so I can't turn it off. Right? That's why we have to keep on going to meetings. Because otherwise the spiritual awakening is going to go away. We're going to go back to sleep. We'll relapse. Right? That's why you got to keep coming back. Right? And you know what the saying is? Keep coming back. It works.
If you work, it will work.
There was a guy back in Pittsburgh. He was an immigrant. His English was not good. And he finished the meeting by saying, keep coming back, it's work. But he was right. So keep coming back, it's work. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk with you.